the quiet hills of Kentucky in 1853, a chilling story unfolded, a tale of vengeance so calculated it would ripple through history. This wasn't a rebellion fought with weapons or open defiance, but a war waged in silence, drop by drop. A young enslaved woman, stripped of freedom but not of resolve, found an untraceable way to strike back at those who owned her life. What drove her to such an extreme act, and how did her quiet rebellion shake an entire household to its core? This is her story, haunting, daring, and unforgettable. If stories like this captivate you, hit that like button, subscribe for more Untold history, and share this video with someone who loves gripping narratives. Every click helps bring forgotten voices back to life. Chapter 1. Shadows over Kentucky. Kentucky in 1853 was a land of sharp contrasts. Rolling hills and fertile fields painted a picture of abundance, yet beneath that beauty lay a brutal system of ownership. The state was a borderland, neither fully north nor south, and its plantations thrived on the labor of enslaved people whose lives were marked by fear and control. To the wealthy families, their sprawling estates symbolized power. To those forced to work the land, they were prisons without walls. The air itself felt heavy with tension. The whispers of abolitionists reached even here, traveling along trade routes and riverbanks, but they were just whispers, dangerous to repeat, deadly to believe in. For enslaved people, survival often meant silence, compliance, and the suppression of hope. Yet in that silence, a quiet defiance simmered. In this setting, households ran like well-oiled machines, every chore, every meal, every breath overseen by masters and mistresses who believed themselves untouchable. They dined at polished tables, their lives cushioned by wealth, unaware of the resentment festering in their own kitchens. The very hands that served their tea and prepared their food belonged to people who were denied humanity, dignity, and choice. This was the world that shaped our protagonist's life. A young woman whose name history barely recorded, but whose actions would leave an indelible mark. She had no rights, no power, no weapons, only her sharp mind and a growing sense that something had to change. In a land where resistance often meant certain death, she was about to plot an act so bold, so unexpected it would shake this Kentucky household to its core. The stage was set. The family felt safe. But in the quiet, someone was already planning their downfall. Chapter 2. A life in chains. She was born into a world that never gave her a choice. From her earliest memory, the crack of a whip and the bark of orders were as normal as birdsong. Childhood for her wasn't about play or dreams, it was about labor. By the time she was tall enough to see over a counter, she was already carrying heavy buckets of water, scrubbing floors until her hands bled, and learning to anticipate every demand from those who claimed to own her. Her life revolved around the needs of others. She woke before sunrise to light fires and prepare breakfast she would never taste. She sewed dresses she would never wear, cleaned rooms she would never sleep in, and served meals she could barely smell without being scolded. And yet, she was expected to smile, or at least to remain invisible. The family she served viewed her not as a person, but as property, a tool to be used and discarded. Even her name, likely given to her by them, was a reminder of their control. In this world, her body wasn't her own, her time wasn't her own. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she carried a spark of something dangerous, a refusal to fully break. For enslaved women, life was an endless balancing act. Survival often meant swallowing anger and hiding every flicker of rebellion. But anger has a way of building, of festering. And in this young woman's case, every insult, every beating, every night spent in fear became fuel for a plan no one could have seen coming. She didn't know it yet, but her story was about to shift from survival to resistance. Her chains might have held her body, but her mind was already plotting an escape far more daring than flight. Chapter 3. Poison in Plain Sight. The idea didn't come to her overnight. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across a field. At dusk, in the kitchen where she spent most of her days, She learned more than just recipes and measurements. She learned secrets. She learned which herbs soothed a cough, which roots eased pain, and which plants, if misused, could silence a person forever. Knowledge was power, and in a world where she had none, this knowledge became her weapon. Poison wasn't just a tool. It was a form of invisible rebellion. Unlike a physical attack, which would almost certainly lead to immediate capture and death, poison could be slow, subtle, and devastating. A sprinkle of powder, a few drops stirred into tea. Acts so small, they could be overlooked until it was too late. She didn't learn these things through formal instruction. Enslaved communities often passed down wisdom about herbs and remedies, born from generations of survival. What healed could also harm, and she began to notice how closely the two walked hand in hand. In her mind, each plant became a symbol, a reminder that even in captivity, nature offered a kind of quiet justice. At first it was just an idea, a dangerous thought she didn't dare say aloud. But the cruelty she endured, the daily humiliation, and the sight of her family and friends suffering sharpened that thought into resolve. She began studying her master's routines, when they ate, what they drank, who they trusted to prepare their food. Her position in the kitchen gave her both the access and the cover she needed. The plan was forming. The house remained calm, unaware, but with every passing day, she was no longer just a servant. She was a strategist, preparing her silent strike. Chapter 4. The Family's Fortress. The family she served lived in a world entirely separate from her own, even though they shared the same roof. Their mansion stood proudly atop a rise, with sprawling fields stretching to the horizon, a display of wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor. The house itself was a fortress of privilege, high ceilings, polished floors, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazing down from gilded frames. Every detail screamed status. Inside those walls, luxury was the air they breathed. The master of the house, a man who prided himself on his gentlemanly demeanor, was known for his temper behind closed doors. His wife carried herself with grace, but her words cut sharper than any whip. Their children, growing up in this environment, absorbed a sense of entitlement so deep they barely acknowledged the people who raised them, dressed them, and served their meals. To outsiders, this family seemed untouchable. Their wealth and influence shielded them from suspicion, criticism, and even consequence. They held lavish dinners, welcomed important guests, and carried on with their lives as if the world outside their estate barely existed. But this illusion of safety was a weakness in itself. The enslaved workers in their home, especially those in the kitchen, moved like ghosts, seen but never truly noticed. That invisibility was her greatest advantage. She could study every habit, every favorite dish, every indulgence without anyone suspecting her intentions. The family's arrogance blinded them to the danger quietly brewing at their own table. She walked through that house every day, carrying trays, polishing silver, and keeping her head low. But behind her lowered eyes, she was memorizing everything: who liked their tea sweet, who preferred wine with dinner, and where they kept their medicine cabinet. The fortress they trusted so much was already cracking from within. Chapter 5. The first drop, the first act was so small, so ordinary, that no one could have imagined its significance. A few drops, carefully measured, slipped into a cup of tea. That was all it took to set her plan in motion. Her hands didn't shake as she stirred. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. The scent of the drink masked any trace of bitterness. When she carried it to the table, her expression was calm, almost indifferent. The master of the house took his usual seat at the head of the table. He didn't look at her as she placed the cup in front of him. He never did. He sipped it without hesitation, completely unaware that the servant standing silently by his side had just changed the course of his life. Hours passed before the first signs appeared. A sudden wave of nausea, a pale face, a quick excuse to leave the room. No one thought much of it. An upset stomach was nothing unusual. But she knew. She watched as whispers rippled through the house. Perhaps he's overworked. Maybe something he ate. No one suspected her, and why would they? She was invisible to them, a shadow that served and obeyed. That invisibility was her shield, her greatest weapon. With each passing hour, she grew bolder, slipping through the halls like a phantom, her mind sharp and calculating. This was only the beginning. The illness would pass, or so they thought. But with every meal, every drink, she held their fate in her hands. The house was still calm, the family still confident in their safety, but she had crossed a line she could never uncross. There was no turning back now. Chapter 6. A Silent Storm. The sickness crept through the house like a ghost, striking quietly and without warning. At first it was only the master of the house, pale and sweating, his strength slipping day by day. Doctors were called, their carriages rolling up the long drive, bringing with them bottles of tonics and promises of recovery. But their treatments did nothing. He grew weaker, his temper shorter, his booming voice replaced by labored breaths. Then came the mistress. She fell ill a week later, her face drawn and gray, her once commanding presence reduced to fragile whispers. Servants moved frantically through the halls, fetching water, changing sheets, trying to maintain order, but fear clung to every corner of the mansion. No one suspected foul play. How could they? The idea that a woman they barely acknowledged could be orchestrating this silent chaos never crossed their minds. She was there for every cough, every fevered groan, moving quietly with bowls of broth and cool cloths. Her face was calm, her voice soft, her obedience unwavering. In truth, she was watching her plan unfold with meticulous precision. The household's rhythms began to falter. Dinners grew quieter. Guests stopped visiting. The once bustling estate felt heavy with unease. Children were ushered away from sick rooms, their laughter replaced by whispers of worry. The family's fortress of privilege was crumbling from the inside, yet they were blind to the source of their misfortune, and she, the architect of this storm, remained invisible. Every poisoned sip, every failing breath strengthened her resolve. For the first time she felt power, terrifying, intoxicating power, but with power came danger. She knew that suspicion, once sparked, could spread as quickly as the sickness she'd unleashed. For now, though, her secret was safe. The storm raged on, unseen. Chapter 7. The breaking point. The house was no longer a home. It was a place of dread. Curtains stayed drawn. Meals went untouched, and the once proud family rarely left their rooms. The master's booming voice was gone entirely now, replaced by groans of pain and fevered ramblings. The mistress, once the commanding presence of the estate, could hardly lift her head from her pillow. Their children watched from the shadows, confusion and fear settling into their young faces. Whispers filled the halls. The staff, too, was frightened. They worked tirelessly to clean sick rooms, prepare food, and care for their ailing masters, but their efforts seemed pointless. The sickness wasn't stopping. In fact, it was spreading. A guest who'd visited for dinner days earlier fell ill shortly after leaving, causing murmurs of a strange fever to ripple through nearby farms. Fear was beginning to travel beyond the estate's gates, and yet, in the kitchen, she moved, with steady hands. No one questioned her. They were too distracted, too desperate for order. Her calmness made her invisible, and invisibility was the perfect disguise. She'd become both caretaker and executioner, slipping seamlessly between roles. But the plan that had once seemed so controlled was now spiraling. Every cough, every pale face added a weight to her chest. The line between justice and vengeance blurred. Would she stop? Could she? Or had she crossed into a path that offered no way back? Then came the breaking point. The master collapsed in his study, and panic exploded through the mansion. Servants raced for doctors, for remedies, for anything that could stop this invisible curse. Suspicion began to flicker. People started glancing at one another with wary eyes. Someone, they thought, must be responsible, and she knew. It was only a matter of time before they looked at her. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom. The illusion couldn't last forever. Fear has a way of sharpening instincts, and soon whispers turned to accusations. Servants were questioned, routines scrutinized, and every bite of food became a source of suspicion. The family, desperate and paranoid, began to see enemies everywhere. And finally, eyes turned toward her, the quiet servant who was always near, always present, always in the kitchen. She was seized and interrogated, dragged into a dimly lit room where her trembling hands were tied. The same family she had served since childhood now regarded her with open hatred and fear. Their voices were sharp, demanding answers. Under threats, beatings, or perhaps sheer exhaustion, the truth spilled out. She confessed. Justice in 1853. Kentucky wasn't justice at all, not for her. She was property in the eyes of the law, and her crime was not simply murder, it was rebellion. For enslaved people, defiance itself was unforgivable. Trials were a formality, and her sentence was certain before she even stepped into the courtroom. Records from this era are scarce, but history tells us what likely happened next. Executions of enslaved people who harmed their owners were swift and brutal, hangings or public punishments designed to send a message of fear to others. Her life would not be remembered with dignity by those in power. They would erase her name, twist her motives, and ensure her story lived on only as a warning. Yet even as she faced her fate, she had done something extraordinary. She had struck fear into the very system that tried to crush her spirit. She had shown that even within chains, resistance was possible. Her body would be punished, but her defiance couldn't be buried. That perhaps was its own kind of freedom. Chapter 9. Legacy in Shadows. Her name may have been lost, but her act left ripples that history could never fully erase. In a time when enslaved people were stripped of their humanity, her rebellion shattered the illusion of control that slaveholders clung to. Stories like hers, though often buried or distorted, carried whispers of warning. Enslaved people were not passive. They were not content. They were fighting in every way they could, sometimes with escape, sometimes with subtle sabotage, and, in rare, desperate cases like this, with poison. Slaveholders used her story to reinforce fear, tightening their grip, spreading propaganda that enslaved people were dangerous and needed discipline. But beneath that fear lay something they would never admit: power. She had flipped the script. With no army, no allies, and no freedom, she had made her oppressors feel vulnerable in their own home. Her story also reflects a truth that is often sanitized in history books. Resistance was everywhere. From revolts to secret schools, from coded songs to stolen moments of autonomy, enslaved people found countless ways to reclaim some piece of themselves. Her choice was extreme, yes, but it came from a world of extreme cruelty. Today, historians dig through archives to uncover these stories, piecing together the humanity of people whose lives were deliberately erased. Each rediscovered act of resistance reminds us that enslaved people were never mere victims of history. They were agents of their own destiny, no matter how grim the odds. Her story lingers in the shadows of time, a reminder of how desperation can spark bravery and how even the smallest acts can ripple through history. She may not have lived to see freedom, but her defiance, quiet, deadly, unforgettable, still speaks louder than the silence her captors tried to impose. Chapter 10. Remembering her story, history often forgets the names of people like her. Records fade, documents are lost, and those in power rarely wrote about enslaved people with care or respect. Yet her story survives, not in full detail, but in fragments, in whispers, and in the uneasy legacy it left behind. And maybe that's fitting. She was a woman who used silence as her greatest weapon. Now, her silence challenges us to listen closer. When we look back at stories like this, it's easy to see them as distant tragedies, locked away in dusty archives. But this isn't just a tale of a long-ago crime. It's a mirror reflecting the cruelty and injustice of an entire system. She wasn't a villain, nor was she simply a victim. She was a person forced into impossible choices, a woman who found power in the only way her world allowed. Remembering her isn't about glorifying violence. It's about understanding desperation. It's about acknowledging that history is full of untold stories of resistance, stories that remind us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, courage flickered. She represents thousands of others who fought in small and large ways against the chains that bound them. Today, her act feels both haunting and inspiring. Haunting because it reminds us of how deep suffering can run. Inspiring because it proves that even in a world built to erase her, she carved her mark in history. As you sit here, listening to her story, you carry her memory forward. Her name may be lost, but her defiance lives on. And maybe that's the greatest legacy she could leave behind, proof that she was never just property, never just a shadow. She was human, and she made the world remember her. Stories like this aren't easy to hear. They're raw, unsettling, and they force us to confront a part of history that many would rather ignore. But that's exactly why they need to be told. This young woman's name may not have survived, but her courage, her desperation, and her quiet act of rebellion echo through time. She represents thousands of unheard voices, people who resisted in ways history books rarely mention. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Ask yourself, how many stories like hers have been forgotten? How many acts of quiet bravery are buried beneath layers of silence? By watching and sharing this video, you're helping keep her memory alive. You're refusing to let history erase her humanity. So if you believe stories like hers matter, show it. Hit that like button, subscribe for more untold history, and share this video with someone who values truth. Together, we can shed light on